The morning Maria Carver climbed onto the eastbound stage out of Harlow Creek, Texas. She had exactly $3.40, a flour sack packed with 2 dresses and her mother's Bible, and a folded piece of paper with a name written on it in her late father's trembling hand. Matthew Boone, Coulter's Crossing, New Mexico Territory. She did not know what kind of man Matthew Boone was. She did not know whether he was kind or cruel, old or young, honest or the sort who smiled at a lady's face while picking her pocket with the other hand. What she knew was that her father, Samuel Carver, had written that name down in the final weeks of his life with the kind of desperate certainty a dying man reserves for the things he believes will save the people he loves. He had pressed the paper into her palm and said, "If there is ever nothing left here for you, Maria, you go find Matthew Boone. He will not turn you away." Then he closed his eyes and he never opened them again. That had been 4 months ago. 4 months of trying to hold the Carver homestead together with her bare hands, fighting off the creditors her father had accumulated during his long illness, watching the land and the mule and the plow get swallowed one by one into the enormous hungry mouth of debt. The bank in Harlow Creek had been sympathetic in the way banks always are, which is to say not at all. The neighbors had been kind, bringing bread and murmured condolences, but they had their own troubles and their own mouths to feed. By the end of September 1882, Maria Carver had nothing left but that name on a piece of paper and enough stubbornness to do something about it. She was 24 years old, and she had never been further from Harlow Creek than the county fair. The stage ride to Abilene took 2 days and made her back feel like it had been taken apart and put back together wrong. She sat squeezed between a traveling preacher who smelled of cedar and a heavy-set merchant who snored for the entire second day with his head tilted back and his mouth open to the Lord. Maria spent those hours watching the flat brown Texas earth roll past the window and holding the paper in her lap, smoothing it with her thumb, reading the name over and over as though repetition might conjure information that was not there. She had tried to learn what she could before leaving. Old Bess Hartley at the post office remembered a Boone family from years back, said they had been cattle people, said there had been a son who went west with a reputation for horse sense and hard work. That was the sum total of what anyone in Harlow Creek knew about Matthew Boone, and it was a thin thing to travel on. In Abilene, she spent 35 cents on a meal she barely tasted, and another $1.50 on a seat aboard the westbound Santa Fe Railway, which would carry her as far as Las Vegas, New Mexico, from which point she had been told she could find a stage line running south and west toward the settlements. The train was loud and smelled of coal smoke and human closeness, and she sat with her flour sack in her lap and watched the land change around her, watched it go from flat to rolling to the raw red and ochre of the territory she was entering, and she felt something shift inside her chest, not quite fear and not quite excitement, but some strange combination of the two that made it hard to breathe evenly. The woman across the aisle introduced herself as Clara Whitfield. She was perhaps 50, with silver hair pinned neatly under a sensible bonnet, and she had the calm, watchful eyes of someone who has seen a great deal and judged very little of it. "Traveling alone?" Clara asked, not unkindly. "Yes, ma'am," Maria said. "To family," Maria hesitated. "To find someone, a man my father knew." Clara looked at her steadily. "You know this man well?" "I do not know him at all," Maria admitted. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, the territory is full of people who started with less than that. You carry yourself well, and that counts for something." She reached into her bag and produced an orange, which she peeled and divided with careful hands and offered half to Maria without ceremony. Maria ate it and felt obscurely grateful, not just for the fruit but for the lack of pity in it. Las Vegas, New Mexico was not what she expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. It was a proper town, with a central plaza and stone buildings and the constant noise and energy of a railroad terminus. She arrived in the early afternoon and spent 2 hours navigating the confusion of the stage depot before she found the line that ran toward the southwest, toward the settlements along the Rio Grande and beyond. The man at the ticket window had a thick mustache and the practiced disinterest of someone who has answered 10,000 questions. "Coulter's Crossing," he repeated when she asked. "That's a ways. You'd go to Socorro, then pick up a local line to Fort Cummings Junction, then you're on horseback or wagon the last stretch. Small place, ranching country mostly." "How far is the last stretch?" she asked. 12, 15 miles depending on how you go. There's usually a man runs a freight wagon through. Name of Prout. He'll carry a passenger for the right coin." She thanked him and bought her ticket to Socorro, which cost her the last of her money saved for a quarter and 2 dimes. She was down to 45 cents, and a paper with a name on it. And she was somewhere in the middle of the New Mexico territory, with no way home and no certainty at the other end of the road. She stepped out of the ticket office into the high, dry air and looked up at the sky, which was enormous and blue and absolutely indifferent, and she thought of her father's voice, steady even when the rest of him was failing, and she squared her shoulders and picked up her flour sack. She was going to find Matthew Boone. The stage to Socorro took another day and a half and introduced her to road conditions that made the Texas stage feel like a parlor ride. The driver was a laconic man named Odell who spoke approximately 12 words over the entire journey, all of them practical. The other passengers were a young Mexican couple traveling with a sleeping infant, and a land surveyor with ink-stained fingers who spent the journey making notes in a leather-bound ledger. Maria helped rock the baby when it cried during a long stretch of rough road, and the young mother, whose name was Esperanza, smiled at her with tired, grateful eyes and pressed a small corn cake wrapped in cloth into her hand when they parted in Socorro. In Socorro she found Prout without much difficulty. He was a barrel-shaped man of indeterminate age, with a red face and hands that looked like they had been carved from old saddle leather, and he was loading a freight wagon outside a general store when she approached him. "Coulter's Crossing," he said, squinting at her. "What business you got out there?" "I am looking for a man named Matthew Boone," she said. Something shifted in Prout's expression. Not wariness exactly, more like recognition. "Boone," he said, and let the word sit in the air for a moment. "You know Matthew Boone?" "My father did," she said. "He told me to find him." Prout studied her with those squinting eyes for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he jerked his head at the wagon. "I leave tomorrow morning dawn. There's room for a passenger if you can get yourself up on the bench and hold on. Won't be smooth, won't be pretty, but I'm going through Coulter's Crossing." "What do you want for it?" she asked, though her stomach tightened because she had 45 cents. "Your father know Matthew Boone from the war?" Prout asked instead of answering. She did not know. Her father had never spoken of the specifics. "He might have," she said carefully. Prout scratched his jaw. "Boone's a decent man. If your father was a friend of his, I won't charge you." He went back to loading his wagon. "Dawn, don't be late." She was not late. She was sitting on the bench in the dark 30 minutes before the sky even began to lighten in the east, her flour sack between her feet, the piece of paper folded inside her mother's Bible for safekeeping. Prout arrived without comment, climbed up, clicked his tongue at the 2 big draft horses, and they rolled out of Socorro into the cold desert morning. For the first hour she was too cold to think about anything except being cold. The New Mexico territory in late October had a bite to it that Harlow Creek had never prepared her for. A dry, sharp cold that came with the wind off the mountains and cut straight through her good wool coat. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself and watched the landscape lighten from black to gray to the startling, copper-and-rose palette of sunrise over desert country. And despite everything, she thought it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Prout, it turned out, was more talkative when he was driving than when he was loading. He told her about the country they were passing through, named the mountains to the north and west, described the history of the settlements they skirted, spoke of the cattle trade that was the backbone of the territory's economy, mentioned the railroad coming through, and what it would mean for the small ranching outfits. He did not tell her much about Matthew Boone, but when she asked direct questions, he answered them. He runs a cattle spread about 1,000 acres. Good land, some of it. He bought it 5-6 years back from a man named Alderton who was done with ranching life. He's done well with it, works hard, fair to his hands, keeps to himself mostly. Is he married? She asked, and was surprised by how much she cared about the answer. Prout glanced at her sideways. Was, he said. Wife died. 2 years back, maybe 3, fever. There's a little girl, name of Rose, about 4 or 5 years old. Maria absorbed this. A widower with a small child, a man who kept to himself. 1,000 acres of desert rangeland, and a name on a piece of paper. What does he look like? She asked, because she realized she had no idea how she would recognize him. Prout seemed to find this mildly amusing. Tall, dark hair, though it's going gray at the temples. Maybe 30, 32. Got a scar along his jaw from some disagreement years back. You'll know him when you see him. He's the kind of man you notice. She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing, and Prout drove, and the desert unrolled around them under that enormous sky. They came into Coulter's crossing just after noon. It was smaller than Socorro, smaller than she had imagined, a main street with perhaps a dozen buildings, a livery, a general store, a saloon, a small church at the far end, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings spreading back from the central road. There was a quality to the light here that was different from anything she had known, a clarity that made everything look sharp and close, as though the air itself was thinner and purer, and let the world in without softening. Prout pulled up in front of the general store and helped her down with more courtesy than she had expected. Boone's spread is about 4 miles east, he said. You can hire a horse at the livery, or you could ask inside. Hobbs knows everyone. She thanked him and pushed open the door of the general store. The man behind the counter was short and round with a fringe of white hair and the cheerful, curious expression of someone who considers information the best currency there is. He confirmed that he was Hobbs, confirmed that he knew Matthew Boone, and confirmed that getting out to the Boone spread was a 4-mile ride down the eastern road. He also offered her a rocking chair, a cup of coffee, and enough questions to fill a Wednesday afternoon, all delivered with such friendly energy that she found herself answering more than she had intended. So Samuel Carver's daughter, Hobbs said, leaning on the counter with both hands flat, wearing an expression she could not quite read. Well, I don't know the connection, but I'll tell you what, Matthew Boone is going to want to see you. Man doesn't get many visitors from his past. Do you think he'll see me? She asked. See you? Hobbs laughed. Girl, Matthew Boone is the most decent man in this territory. He'd see a stranger in need off the street, let alone a friend's daughter. He began talking to his wife in the back room, a loud conversation that resulted in a young stable hand, named Eli, being produced and instructed to ride Maria out to the Boone spread in Hobbs's own wagon. She sat beside Eli, who was perhaps 17 and absolutely tongue-tied in her company, and she held her flour sack in her lap and watched the eastern road unreel ahead of them. The land here was different from the desert scrub she had come through, greener in a way that surprised her, with bunch grasses and juniper and the occasional cottonwood along the dry wash beds. She could see cattle in the distance, small dark shapes against the pale grass. She could see a windmill turning slowly against the sky. Then she saw the house. It was not what she expected, because she had been half bracing herself for a rough cabin, the sort of dwelling a man keeps when there is no woman to make it more. Instead, it was a proper house, adobe with a covered porch running the length of the front, painted window frames, and flower boxes that still held the dried stalks of summer blooms. There was a barn behind it, large and well-kept, and several corrals, and a row of cottonwoods along the north side that had gone gold with the season. A small girl was sitting on the porch steps. She was perhaps 5, with dark hair in 2 loose braids and her father's serious, watchful eyes, and she looked up at the wagon with the calm, assessing gaze of a child who has learned to read arrivals carefully. She was wearing a blue dress and holding a rag doll by one arm with the careless confidence of long ownership. "Hello," Maria said, climbing down from the wagon before Eli could help her. The little girl looked at her. "Are you lost?" she asked. "I do not think so," Maria said. "Is your father here? Your name is Rose, is that right?" The little girl blinked. "How do you know my name?" "A man in town told me," Maria said honestly. "I've come a long way to see your father." Rose considered this with great seriousness. Then she turned her head and called at a volume that was startling from such a small person, "Papa, there is a lady here. She knows my name." There was a pause. Then the sound of boots on wooden floors and the front door opened, and Matthew Boone stepped out onto the porch. Prue had said she would know him when she saw him, and Prue was right. He was tall, as Prue had said, with the kind of lean, broad-shouldered build that came from actual work rather than any vanity about it. His hair was dark, with threads of gray at the temples that had come too early and suited him anyway. He had a strong jaw with the scar Prue had mentioned, a thin, pale line that ran from just below his left ear toward his chin. He was wearing a worn canvas jacket and working clothes, and he had clearly been in the middle of something, because there was a wrench in one hand and a smear of grease on his forearm, and he looked at her with dark brown eyes that were sharp and entirely unreadable. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that does not raise itself unnecessarily. Maria stood in the dirt yard with her flour sack and her mother's Bible and took a breath. "My name is Maria Carver," she said. "My father was Samuel Carver. He passed away in June of this year. Before he died, he told me that if I ever had nowhere to go, I should come find you. He gave me your name written on a piece of paper." She opened the Bible and took out the folded paper and held it up, not as proof exactly, but because she had carried it so long it felt like part of the introduction. Something moved across Matthew Boone's face. It started in his eyes, a flicker of something old and deep, and moved through the rest of his expression like a slow tide. He came down the porch steps and crossed the yard to where she stood, and he took the paper from her hand and unfolded it and looked at the handwriting for a long moment. His jaw tightened. He folded it again and held it carefully. "Samuel Carver," he said, very quietly. "Yes, sir," she said. He looked up at her, and now there was something unguarded in his face that had not been there a moment before. "He was my sergeant," he said. "In the war. He saved my life." A pause. "How long have you been traveling?" 8 days, she said. He was quiet for another moment, studying her with those dark eyes, not in a way that made her feel surveyed or reduced, but in the way of someone who is simply trying to understand the full shape of a thing. Then he said, "You must be hungry." "I am," she admitted, because there was no point in being otherwise. "Come inside," he said. And then to Eli, still sitting in the wagon and watching all this with wide eyes, "Tell Hobbs I said thank you." She followed Matthew Boone up the porch steps and through the front door of the house that would eventually become her home, and she did not know that yet, did not even allow herself to think it. But something in the way the house smelled wood smoke and leather, and something warm and domestic that she could not name made her feel, for the first time in 4 months, that she had perhaps stopped falling. The inside of the house was clean and spare, with the particular quality of a dwelling kept tidy by someone who was not entirely comfortable with disorder, but also had no talent for softness. There was good solid furniture, a stone fireplace with a fire laid and not yet lit for the day, a kitchen that was practical and well stocked. There was a braided rug on the sitting room floor that was clearly handmade and clearly old, and on the mantel there was a small photograph in a wooden frame that she did not look at directly because she understood instinctively what it probably was. Matthew Boone set about making food with the economy of motion of a man who has been managing for himself. He put a pot of beans on the fire, cut bread, sliced cheese, poured her a cup of coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in and exactly what she needed. Rose appeared and sat across the table and watched Maria with the unblinking attention of a child conducting serious research. "Where did you come from?" Rose asked. "Texas," Maria said. Rose considered this. Is Texas far? Very, Maria said. Why did you come here? Rose, Matthew said, not harshly. It's all right, Maria said. I came because your grandfather, she paused because that was not quite right, because someone I trusted told me to. Rose seemed to find this acceptable. She went back to her rag doll. Matthew sat across from Maria with his own coffee and the paper still on the table between them, and he asked her about her father in the gentle, careful way of someone who wants to know everything, but understands that knowledge comes at a cost. She told him about Samuel Carver's last years, the illness, the debt, the long, slow diminishment of the homestead, and she was careful to be factual about it because she had not yet cried about it, and she did not intend to start in front of a stranger. Matthew listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He wrote to me years ago. When I first came out here, we lost touch after that." He looked down at his coffee. "I'm sorry I didn't know. I would have done something sooner." "You didn't know there was anything to be done," she said. "Still," he said. They ate the beans and bread, and Rose ate with great concentration and occasional observations about the rag doll's feelings regarding lunch, and the fire crackled, and outside the New Mexico afternoon went golden and long. Maria felt the tension in her body beginning to ease by degrees, the tight watchfulness she had been carrying for 8 days and really for 4 months, and she was almost alarmed by how much it hurt to let it go. After lunch, Matthew showed her the room she could have. It was at the back of the house, with a window that looked east over open land, and it had a bed with a good quilt and a washstand and a hook on the door, and a rag rug on the floor that matched the one in the sitting room. It was clearly a guest room that had not been used as such for some time, because it had the faint staleness of a closed space, but it was clean, and it was private. And when he stepped back to let her in, she had to put her hand on the doorframe for a moment because the relief of it was almost physical. "You can stay as long as you need," he said from the doorway. "There's no obligation attached to that." She turned to look at him. "I have 45 cents to my name," she said, because she thought he should know the full extent of it. "Then you stay until you have more," he said simply. "My father's friend's daughter is not going to be turned out into the territory with 45 cents. She thought about arguing with this and then decided it would be foolish. "I'll work," she said. "I'm not afraid of work. I can cook, I can sew, I can help with whatever needs doing." He looked at her for a moment. "There's plenty that needs doing," he said, and something about the way he said it was not unkind. "We'll figure it out." He left her to settle in. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and the big, open, copper-colored sky beyond it, and for the first time since her father had died, she let herself cry. Not for long, just long enough. The next morning she was up before dawn. She had found the kitchen the night before, noted the state of the pantry and the range, assessed what was available and what was needed. By the time Matthew came in from his first round of morning checks, which she had heard him leave for before first light, she had biscuits in the oven and bacon in the pan and coffee on the fire, and Rose was sitting at the table in her nightgown with her hair in yesterday's braids, eating a biscuit with absolute seriousness. Matthew stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene with an expression she could not fully read. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to," she said. "Sit down. Coffee's ready." He sat, he ate. He said the biscuits were the best he'd had since, and then he stopped himself, and she understood what he had stopped himself from saying, and she simply refilled his coffee and asked him what needed to be done that day. He told her. She listened, and that was how it began. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Maria had not expected to fall into so easily. She cooked and cleaned and mended and kept the house running, and she found in the doing of it a satisfaction that was partly the satisfaction of useful work and partly something harder to name, a feeling of fitting into a space that had needed filling. Rose attached herself to Maria with the speed and totality of a lonely child who has found an unexpected warmth, and within the first week was following her around the kitchen, sitting beside her at the sewing table, asking the kind of continuous, sideways questions that children use to learn everything there is to know about a person. Maria learned things too. About the Boone spread, about the cattle operation, about the history of Coulter's crossing. She learned that Matthew had two ranch hands, brothers named Cord and Dell, who lived in a bunkhouse behind the barn, and who regarded her arrival with the cautious approval of men who are deeply relieved that someone else will now be managing the meals. She learned that the nearest town of any real size was Socorro, 20-plus miles west, and that Coulter's crossing had its social life centered in the general store and the small church at the end of the main road. She learned that Matthew Boone rose before dawn every day and worked until after dark, and that he was harder on himself than on any of his hands. She learned that he was quiet by nature but not by coldness, that he listened to Rose's long rambling stories with complete attention, that he knew every animal on his spread by character if not by name, that he had read more books than she would have expected from a rancher in the high desert. She found them on a shelf in his office, which she cleaned for the first time in what appeared to be months, stacked with the careless affection of a reader who does not need them to be tidy, just available. She left the books exactly as she found them. She dusted around them. What she did not learn in those first weeks was how to be comfortable in his presence without being distracted by it. That was the problem. She had not expected it, had come here with no expectations beyond survival, and yet there it was, an awareness of him that she could not entirely account for on practical grounds. The way he moved through his own land with absolute ease, the way his voice dropped when he was talking to Rose and went gentle in a way he seemed not to notice, the way he would sometimes look up from whatever he was doing when she came into a room and hold the look for a half-second too long before dropping his eyes and going back to work. She told herself it was gratitude. She was grateful for the shelter and the food and the safety, and she was projecting that gratitude onto him in the form of an admiration that had nothing to do with. She told herself this quite firmly and went on making biscuits. It was Hobbs who complicated things first. She had ridden into Coulter's crossing with Cord to pick up supplies about 3 weeks into her stay, and Hobbs had received her in his store with the warm, proprietary enthusiasm of someone who feels he had a hand in a good outcome. "How are you settling in?" he asked, loading her order with happy efficiency. "Very well," she said honestly. "It's a good place." "And how's Matthew?" "He's well," she said. "The same, I assume. I don't know him well enough to judge." Hobbs looked at her over the counter with those bright, assessing eyes. "He seems better," Hobbs said. "Cord told me. Said there's been food worth eating in that house for the first time in 2 years. "I'm glad to be useful," she said carefully. "He's a good man," Hobbs said with the particular emphasis of someone transmitting information. "Hard time losing Margaret. She was a fine woman. But a man like that isn't meant to be alone, and that child isn't meant to grow up without some softness in the house." Maria kept her expression neutral. "He's been very kind to me," she said. Hobbs smiled, which was not the neutral response she had been hoping for. On the ride back she sat beside Cord and looked at the eastern road and the mountains in the distance and told herself again that she was here out of practical necessity and gratitude, and that she had no business developing any other kind of feeling about Matthew Boone's dark eyes or his low voice or the way he had looked at that piece of paper with her father's handwriting on it. She was still telling herself this that evening when Matthew came into the kitchen while she was washing the supper dishes and picked up a cloth without being asked and began drying them, and they stood side by side in the fire-lit kitchen and worked in the comfortable silence of people who have gotten used to each other, and she thought that this was, in its quiet way, one of the nicest moments she could remember in a long time. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "The war," she said. "You and my father." "What happened?" There was a pause. He put a dry plate on the shelf. "Chickamauga," he said. "September of '63. I was 21 and very convinced of my own invulnerability, which is the particular stupidity of young men in wars. We got separated from our unit. I took a rifle ball in the shoulder. Your father carried me 3 miles through enemy-held ground on a night when the temperature dropped below freezing, and then spent the next 6 weeks making sure I did not lose the arm to infection. He was quiet for a moment. I owed him a debt I never had the chance to repay. She thought about this. About her father, who had been a quiet, careful man who had rarely spoken of the war, who had carried things inside him that he had never fully put into words. She thought about him carrying a wounded boy 3 miles through frozen Georgia darkness, and she felt the familiar grief and beneath it a complicated pride. He never told me about that, she said. He wouldn't, Matthew said. That was his nature. Yes, she said, it was. They finished the dishes in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, warmer, more full. In November, the weather turned serious. The mornings were bitter, and the wind had an edge that cut, and Matthew brought extra blankets out of storage without being asked and left them at her door, and there was something in that small practical act that she found oddly moving. He was not a demonstrative man. He expressed care through action, through the practical arrangement of things, through showing up. She was beginning to understand this about him the way you begin to understand the grammar of a language you are still learning. The cattle operation hit trouble in mid-November. A section of fence on the eastern boundary had come down in a windstorm, and a portion of the herd had drifted onto land that belonged to a neighboring rancher named Garrett Hollies, who was the sort of man who operated with a wide definition of his own rights and a narrow one of everyone else's. Hollies sent a man to the Boone spread with a message that was civil enough on the surface, but had an undertone that Matthew understood immediately, and Maria, listening from the kitchen doorway, understood as well. He's claiming 12 head that aren't his, Matthew said when the messenger had gone. He was standing in the yard with his hat in his hand and the look of a man calculating patience against principle. What are you going to do? She asked. Ride over and talk to him, he said. And hope talking is enough. Should you take someone with you? She meant Cord or Dell, but she was aware of a separate worry underneath the practical one that she did not examine directly. He looked at her for a moment. I'll take Cord, he said. They went the next morning. They came back by afternoon with all 12 head and an expression on Matthew's face that suggested the conversation had been more pointed than talking but less serious than trouble. He said Hollies had backed down. He said it in the way of a man who is not surprised that the other man backed down but is glad not to have had to push harder. Cord was slightly more expansive about it and used the phrase. Boone looked at him like he was something to be scraped off a boot with evident admiration, which made Maria smile into her coffee cup. The fence? She asked Matthew. Fixed, he said. We rode the whole line while we were out there. Then that's done, she said. Then that's done, he agreed, and sat down to the supper she had kept warm, and ate it with the particular appreciation of someone who has been cold and tired and now isn't, and she sat across from him with her own plate, and thought that this, too, was a kind of contentment she had not expected. December arrived with snow on the mountains and a sharp clarity to the air that made the horizon look closer than it was. The town of Coulter's Crossing organized a community gathering for the Christmas season at the church, and Hobbs had mentioned it to Maria on her last trip in for supplies with a pointed casualness that she recognized as matchmaking. She mentioned it to Matthew in the same casual way. He looked up from the bridle he was mending by the fire. Rose was already asleep. The evening had the particular settled quiet of after bedtime, and they had gotten into the habit, without either of them precisely deciding to, of sitting in the same room on winter evenings, she with her mending or her reading, he with whatever needed doing by hand, the fire between them. Do you want to go? He asked. I think Rose would like it, she said, which was true and also deflection. He looked at her steadily. That wasn't what I asked. She met his eyes. Yes, she said, I'd like to go. He nodded and went back to the bridle. Then we'll go, he said. The gathering was the following Saturday, and it was the first time she had appeared in Coulter's Crossing society as anything other than a woman passing through or picking up supplies, and she was aware, with a careful, peripheral attention, of how she and Matthew were being looked at together. Not in an unkind way, more in the warm, assessingly hopeful way of a small community that wants good things for the people it likes. Rose wore her best dress, which was green wool with white buttons, and held Matthew's hand on one side and Maria's on the other, and marched into the church hall with the solemn satisfaction of someone participating in an important occasion. There was music and food, and the particular sociable warmth of people crowded together against winter, and Maria found herself talking and laughing with more ease than she had felt in months. And when she turned at one point to find Matthew watching her from across the room with an expression that was quiet and serious, and something else she did not yet have a name for, she felt it go through her like a struck note. He crossed to her side eventually, and they stood together at the edge of the room and watched Rose being enchanted by a puppet show someone had rigged up near the far wall, and he said, quietly, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cold air, "You look like you belong here." She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her now, looking at Rose, but there was color along the edge of his jaw that had not been there a moment ago. "I feel like I might," she said, just as quietly. He did not say anything else, but his hand brushed hers once, not quite accidentally, and she did not move away. They drove home in the wagon under a sky so full of stars it looked like a different sky than the one she had grown up under. Rose asleep in the wagon bed wrapped in blankets, and she sat beside Matthew in the cold dark and felt something settle into place inside her chest, some bone-deep acknowledgement of where she was and who she was with and how far she had come to get here, and she thought, "I am not afraid anymore." She did not know if she meant afraid of the territory or afraid of him or afraid of whatever was growing between them. Perhaps all three, perhaps none of them anymore. January brought the hardest cold of the winter, and with it 2 new developments. The first was that Dell, the younger of the ranch hands, got his foot caught in a fence and broke 2 bones, which put him out of useful work for 6 weeks and stretched the ranch's labor thin. Maria, who was not afraid of the cold or the work, began doing more outside than she had before, helping Cord with feed, learning the water routine for the stock, taking over the morning chicken duties that Rose had nominally been responsible for, but that required supervision the child could not always get from her father. She also learned to ride properly. She could ride, had ridden growing up, but Matthew's horses were a different caliber than the plow horse of her childhood, and she learned on a gray mare named Patience, who had a name that was either ironic or aspirational depending on the day. Matthew taught her, with the careful patience he brought to everything he did well, talking her through the particular way Patience responded to rein pressure, the way to sit a canter in open country, the way to read the animal's ears for mood. One afternoon she got the mare into a genuine run across the flat ground south of the house, the cold air burning her face and her hair coming loose from its pins, and the world going past in a streak of pale grass and blue sky, and she heard Matthew call something behind her that she was going too fast to catch, and she did not care, because she was flying. She pulled Patience up in a wide arc and came back to him at a trot, her face burning and her eyes bright, and he was watching her with his arms crossed, and an expression she recognized now, that particular combination of restraint and something warm underneath it that she had been cataloging quietly for weeks. "I told you to wait for me," he said. "I heard you," she said cheerfully, "but the mare went and I went with her." He looked at her for a moment, then, surprising her, one corner of his mouth turned up, which was as close as he usually got to a smile. "You're a natural," he said. "Your father teach you." "Some," she said. "The rest I made up." "That's obvious," he said, but the not-quite smile stayed. She slid off the mare and led her back toward him, and they walked back toward the barn together in the winter light, and the space between them was exactly the right size, not too much and not too little, and she was aware of every inch of it. The second development in January was a letter. It came via Hobbs's store, forwarded from Socorro, which had forwarded it from somewhere else along a chain of hands that had taken it 6 weeks to travel. It was from her mother's cousin in St. Louis, a woman named Agnes whom Maria had met exactly twice and barely remembered. Agnes wrote that she had heard, through some circuit of family communication that Maria had not known existed, that Samuel Carver had died and that Maria had left Harlow Creek. Agnes wrote that if Maria needed a place to come, there was a room in St. Louis and the possibility of work as a seamstress or a governess. Maria sat at the kitchen table and read this letter twice, and then she looked around the kitchen, at the curtains she had made for the window, at the herbs drying from the ceiling beam, at Rose's small boots by the door, at the fire and the pot of soup on the fire, and she folded the letter back into its envelope and put it in her apron pocket and started a batch of bread. She told Matthew about it that evening. It seemed wrong not to. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "No," she said. He looked at her directly, the way he rarely did in the evenings, which were usually softer somehow, more oblique. "Maria," he said, and stopped. "I don't want to go," she said again clearly. He was quiet for another beat, and she had the sense of a man making a decision about something larger than the immediate conversation. "I'm glad," he said. And then he looked back at the fire and the moment moved past, but it left something behind, a new understood thing, a line drawn. She wrote back to Agnes in St. Louis thanking her for the kind offer and explaining that she had found a situation and was well. She did not explain the nature of the situation because she was not entirely sure she could. February was the month things changed. It was a Sunday, the particular kind of Sunday that January and February manufacture in the high desert, when the sky is a clear, hard blue and the cold is crystalline, and the air smells of frozen earth and pinon smoke, and the day has an almost painful beauty. Rose had gone down with a mild cold, not serious but enough to keep her inside, and she was installed in her bed with her rag doll and a book of illustrated fables that Maria had ordered from Socorro, which had arrived the week before and achieved an immediate position of sacred importance in Rose's life. Maria was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea when Matthew came in from the morning work and stood in the doorway with his jacket still on, looking at her with that expression she could never quite read all the way to the bottom of. "Come outside," he said. "It's cold," she said. "I know," he said. "Come outside anyway." She put her coat on and followed him. He led her around the side of the house to the east-facing porch, which she had not spent much time on in winter because it was the coldest face of the house in the mornings. He stopped and put his hand on her arm to stop her too, and pointed. There were deer. 4 of them, a doe and 3 younger animals, standing in the dry grass perhaps 30 yards from the house, absolutely still, watching them with the liquid, wary attention of creatures deciding whether to stay or go. The morning light was behind them, making their breath visible, turning the grass around their feet to pale gold. Maria stood very still and watched them. After a long, perfect moment, the doe turned and walked east, unhurried, and the others followed, and they vanished into the scrub and the yard was empty again. She let out the breath she had been holding. "Thank you," she said. "I saw them coming in," he said. "I thought you'd want to see." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and they were standing very close together in the cold morning, and the moment had a quality she recognized from dreams, that sense of something about to become irrevocable. "Matthew," she said. "Maria," he said at the same time. They both stopped. The cold air rose between them, and beneath it something much warmer. "I want to say something," he said carefully in the voice of a man who has been composing this for some time. "I have been trying to say it the right way. I don't know if there is a right way, so I am going to say it plainly and ask you to take it in the spirit it's meant." A pause. "You came here because of your father's faith in a man he hadn't seen in 20 years. I am glad beyond what I can say that you did. And I am—" He stopped and seemed to make a decision about something. "I would like to ask you to stay. Not in the arrangement we have now. I would like to ask you to stay because I want you here, in the way a man wants a woman to be part of his life." The cold was very cold and the light was very bright and the land stretched east beyond them, endless and open and beautiful. I have not been able to say this sooner, he went on, because it felt wrong to say it before you'd had time to know your own mind about this place and about. He stopped again. I'm not easy company, I know that. I'm not good at. I work hard and I try to be honest and I love my daughter and Matthew, she said. He stopped. I stayed because I wanted to stay, she said. I answered the letter from St. Louis because I wanted to say no to it. I have been waiting for you to say something because I couldn't say it first without knowing if. She took a breath. I am already in love with you. That is the plain way to say it. The silence after this was extraordinary. Then he took her face in his hands very gently, like something he was afraid to break, and he looked at her for a long moment with those dark, serious eyes. And then he kissed her in the cold February morning with the deer gone and the light gold and the whole eastern world open around them. And it was exactly as she had imagined it would be, and nothing at all like she had imagined, because it was real. And reality is always better and stranger and more itself than the imagined version. When they stepped back, she was shaking slightly, which she told herself was the cold. He kept hold of her hand. I'm going to ask you to marry me, he said, but not today. You should have the full sense of what you're saying yes to before you say yes. She looked at him. I know what I'm saying yes to, she said. Give me 3 months, he said. If you feel the same in May, I'll ask you properly. She recognized the caution in this, understood it was not lack of feeling but the opposite, a man being careful with something he valued too much to rush. All right, she said. May. He squeezed her hand once and then released it, and they went back inside to check on Rose and make breakfast. And if there was something different in the quality of the air between them, it was a good different, warm and deliberate and full of an anticipation that was not anxiety but something lighter. March arrived in the territory with wind and the first tentative hints of warmth underneath the cold, and with it, the particular energy of a working ranch preparing for spring. The cattle would be driven to summer pasture, new calves were arriving, the fence line needed riding, the windmills needed checking. Dell's foot was healed enough for him to work again, and the spread's daily rhythm expanded and deepened. Maria was part of it in a new way now. Not just the house, though the house was hers. She had come to feel this without arrogance, in the way you feel a space is yours when you have cared for it, but the larger life of the ranch. She rode the south pasture with Cord one morning to count calves, which she was not experienced at but was learning. She kept the supply accounts with a precision that Matthew discovered one evening when he picked up the ledger she'd been working on and went quiet for a long moment over the pages. You have a head for this, he said. My father taught me, she said. He said a homestead lives or dies on the accounts. He was right, Matthew said. He set the ledger down. He was right about most things, seems like, she smiled. He was right about you, she said. He looked at her with that still, warm look that she had come to know and love. Go to sleep, Maria, he said. It's late. Good night, Matthew, she said, and meant it as a kind of warmth, and he received it that way. Rose was flourishing. The child had been contained in her happiness before cautious with it, the way children are when they have learned that good things end. And now she was opening like something that had been too long in the shade and was finally getting sun. She talked constantly and laughed easily, and had attached herself to Maria with a love that was both matter-of-fact and ferocious, the way children love when they are fully committed to it. She called Maria Maria and not anything else, because she was a child who was direct about most things, but sometimes, when she was very tired or very content, she would lean against Maria's side with all her small, solid weight, and Maria would put an arm around her, and they would sit like that without needing to name it. One evening in late March, Rose looked up from her fable book and said, without preamble, "Are you going to be my new mama?" Matthew was across the room and Maria felt him go still without looking at him. I would very much like to, Maria said honestly. Rose considered this. Mama used to braid my hair different, she said. In one braid, not two, but I like two. Mama didn't know that. Then we'll do two, Maria said. All right, Rose said and went back to her book. Matthew caught Maria's eye across the room, and there was something in his face that she had never seen on it before, something very young and very open, and she looked away because it felt almost too private to witness. April was gentle and surprising. The desert had flowers. She had not expected this, had thought of the territory as a place that kept its beauty in the large and dramatic sense of mountains and sky and light. But April produced small specific wonders, purple and yellow and red in the grass, the cottonwoods putting out their first pale green leaves, the evenings going long and warm and golden in a way that made everything look lit from within. She and Matthew had fallen into a habit of sitting on the east porch after Rose was in bed, when the day's work was done and the house was quiet, and talking. They talked about everything, the ranch's future, his plans for expanding the herd, her ideas about the kitchen garden she wanted to put in, the books on his shelf that she was now reading with his full encouragement, the territory's politics and the changes the railroad would bring, her childhood in Harlow Creek and his in Missouri before the war itself which he spoke of rarely and carefully, but sometimes with her, said more than he meant to. She learned the shape of his life, the losses and the hard-won things, and she told him the shape of hers, and what she found was that these two shapes, laid alongside each other, were not identical. They had different grains, different textures, but they fit together in the way that means not matching but complementary, the way two different things can complete each other precisely because they are not the same. She also told him things she had not told anyone, things about those 4 months after her father died, the weight of it, the specific loneliness of being the only person in a failing homestead. The moment she had looked at that paper and understood it was the last door. He listened to all of it with that total, serious attention, and when she was finished he said, very quietly, "I am so glad you came," and meant it in a way that went all the way down. On the first day of May, she went looking for him and found him in the barn with one of the mares who had just foaled, a bay with a white mark on her forehead, crouched in the straw with the newborn colt beside her, his big hand flat on the animal's flank. The morning light came through the barn boards in long, slanted bars, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard her and looked up. "Come see," he said. She crossed the barn and knelt beside him in the straw and looked at the colt, who was new and unsteady and already trying to figure out his legs with the optimistic determination of young things. "He's perfect," she said. "He is," Matthew said. They were side by side in the straw, watching the mare and her foal, and the morning light was warm through the barn boards, and she felt the fullness of it, of this place, this life, this man, like something she had been walking toward for years without knowing it. She turned to him. "It's May," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "You said May," she reminded him. He was quiet for a beat. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small thing, a ring, simple, a gold band with a small turquoise stone that was the color of the New Mexico sky on a clear morning. He held it out on his palm. "I had it made in Socorro," he said. "In March. I have been waiting since March." She looked at the ring and then at him. "You were going to wait until May to ask me." "I said I would," he said. "You made the ring in March," she said. "I was fairly confident," he said with that not quite smile. She laughed, which she had not entirely expected, and it came out genuine and warm and a little shaky. "Matthew Boone," she said. "Maria Carver," he said. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger and they looked at it for a moment, there in the straw of the barn in the May morning with the new colt finding his legs beside them. And then he kissed her again, unhurried this time, and she put her hand against his jaw and felt the scar under her fingers and thought of her father carrying a wounded boy through a frozen Georgia night 20 years ago, and thought of the paper with the name on it, and thought of all the unlikely miles between Harlow Creek and here, and felt, with a completeness she had never experienced before, that everything had arrived exactly where it was supposed to be. They were married in June. The ceremony was held in the small church at the end of Coulter's Crossings Main Street on a Saturday morning, when the sky was the precise brilliant blue of high summer, and the air smelled of sage, and the wild roses that grew along the dry wash west of town. Hobbs gave her away, which made him so visibly pleased that he could barely keep the appropriate solemnity, and Rose served as the only flower girl with a seriousness of purpose that was both charming and slightly alarming. Clara Whitfield, the woman from the train who it turned out was now living in Socorro with a sister, had written to say she could not come but sent a package of fine cloth and a note that said simply, "I thought you would find it." The minister was a small, precise man named Reverend Aldrich who had officiated at more weddings than he could count and performed this one with genuine warmth. Matthew stood at the altar in his good black coat with his hat in his hands and looked at Maria coming toward him down the short aisle with an expression so open and unguarded that several people in the front row had to look away. She was wearing a dress she had made herself from the good cloth Clara had sent, a deep blue-green that was somewhere between the sky and the sage, and she had put her hair up properly for once and wore the turquoise ring, and carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Rose had helped her pick that morning, and she walked toward Matthew Boone feeling not nervous but certain in the bone deep, complete way that the best decisions feel when they have finished being made. They said the words. She heard her own voice, clear and steady, saying "I will," and heard his, low and sure, the same. And when Reverend Aldrich pronounced them married and Matthew took her face in his hands and kissed her, the assembled residents of Coulter's Crossing made a sound of collective warmth that was the closest a small frontier town gets to applause in a church. The celebration afterward was at Hobbs's store, which had been cleared of most of its merchandise, and filled with tables and chairs and more food than Maria had seen since before her father's illness. There was fiddle music and dancing, and a great deal of talking and laughing, and Rose ate an amount of pie that was going to have consequences, and Cord and Dell presented a very fine bridle they had made themselves as a gift, and Hobbs gave a toast that went on longer than most but was sincere in every sentence, and by the end of it, Maria was laughing and her eyes were bright with it, and she looked at Matthew across the room and he was already looking at her, and that was how June passed. Summer on the Boone spread was a different world from winter. The land opened up, the days were long and golden, the cattle fattened on the summer grass, and the east porch became their evening living room in earnest, where they sat after Rose was in bed and talked and watched the sky go from blue to indigo to black and fill with stars. She put in her kitchen garden, which was modest the first year because she was learning the soil and the growing season, but produced enough to matter beans, squash, herbs, a small plot of sunflowers that she had planted partly for practical reasons and partly because she loved them. Rose turned 6 in July and had a birthday that involved the entirety of Coulter's Crossing's child population descending on the ranch for an afternoon, an event that left the yard looking like it had been processed by a small, energetic tornado, and left Rose glowing with the particular happiness of a child who has felt properly celebrated. Matthew observed all of this from the periphery with the fond, somewhat baffled expression of a man who did not entirely anticipate this outcome, but is entirely in favor of it, and Maria observed him observing and thought that she had never seen him look like this before, not just content but unclenched, as though some long-held tension had finally been allowed to release. Autumn came back around with its copper and gold, and the sharpness in the air that she loved now, having lived it once and known it again. She had been a year in New Mexico territory. She was a wife and a stepmother and a rancher's partner, and she knew the land now the way you know a place when you have been present in it across all its seasons. She knew the way the light changed in October, the particular sound of the wind in the cottonwoods, the names of the mountains, the names of the cattle, the rhythms of the work that sustained all of it. She also knew that she was pregnant. She told Matthew on a Tuesday evening in early October, sitting on the east porch with the last of the warm light going off the mountains. She had known for 3 weeks and had taken the 3 weeks to be certain, to let the certainty settle, to let herself feel everything she needed to feel about it before she said the word. He went very still, "Matthew," she said. He turned to look at her, and his face was doing something she had not seen before, something he was not controlling, which was unusual because Matthew Boone had excellent control over his expressions and used it consistently. There was a brightness in his eyes that he blinked against once, and then he reached over and took her hand in both of his and held it carefully, as though it were something to be kept safe. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am strong as a horse and feeling fine." He looked at her with that brightness still in his face. "Marya," he said, and then could not seem to find the next thing. "I know," she said. He turned her hand over in his and looked at the turquoise ring on her finger, and then he brought her hand to his mouth and held it there, his lips against her knuckles, for a long moment. It was the most tender thing she had ever seen him do, this careful, private man, and she felt it settle into her the way warmth settles after cold. "I love you," he said against her hand. "I don't say it enough." "You say it in everything you do," she told him. "I know it." They told Rose on a Sunday morning when the three of them were at breakfast together, and Rose received the news with the calculating gravity of a child processing a major development in her world. She asked several precise questions. When would the baby come? Where would it sleep? Would it be annoying? Could she name it? And then announced that she would need to think about all of it and went back to her biscuit. And Marya and Matthew exchanged a look over her head that was entirely made of warmth and barely suppressed laughter. She would need to think about it apparently resolved itself into acceptance by the following afternoon, because Rose appeared in the kitchen while Marya was making bread and announced, without preamble, that she had decided to be a very good sister and would the baby like hearing stories. Marya said yes. She thought the baby would like that very much, and Rose nodded with satisfaction and went back to her fable book. Winter returned, Marya's second New Mexico winter, and she went into it this time knowing it and not fearing it, knowing where the extra blankets were, and how the kitchen stayed warmest, and how to read the sky for the color of cold that meant serious snow. She was large with the baby by December and had altered 2 dresses, and was grateful for the practical wisdom of a mother who had raised her to sew. Matthew was careful with her in the unobtrusive way that she had come to recognize as his particular mode of care, making small adjustments to routines without announcing them, appearing to help with things without making the help feel like management. Christmas came and they spent it at home, just the 3 of them, which was exactly right. She cooked a goose she had traded for with cord and made 2 pies and a batch of the biscuits Matthew had once said were the best he'd had. And in the evening they sat by the fire and Matthew read aloud from one of the books on the shelf, a novel she had not read, something about travelers and distant lands, and his voice in the fire-lit room was low, and even and she drowsed against his shoulder, while Rose fell asleep on the rug with her head on the rag doll. And she thought, "This is the life I did not know to want." The baby came in February, which was her anniversary month in the territory, and it seemed right, a circle completed, a year turned over into a new thing. Matthew sent for the midwife from Socorro 2 weeks early, because he was the kind of man who prepares for important things, and she arrived the week before the baby came and stayed in the guest room that Marya had once occupied, and her name was Señora Fuentes, a compact, serious woman of about 50 with calm hands and a matter-of-fact competence that Marya found immediately steadying. The labor was long but not dangerous. Señora Fuentes was experienced and calm throughout, and Matthew sat outside the bedroom door for the duration, which Marya knew because she could hear his measured footsteps, and because Rose, who had been installed at the Hobbs house for the day but had apparently negotiated a return, reported that Papa is walking back and forth like when the fence broke. The baby arrived in the late afternoon, and it was a boy. He was solid and red-faced and had a howl on him that made Señora Fuentes nod with professional approval. And when they brought Matthew in and put the child in his arms, the expression on his face was beyond description. So open and full and unguarded that Marya, who was exhausted to the bone, and absolutely certain she had never loved anything as much as she loved the two of them together in that moment, started crying without quite meaning to. "Hello," Matthew said to the baby, very quietly, looking down at this new small person with that overwhelming expression. "Hello." Rose came in and stood on her tiptoes to look and said, "He is very red," which was accurate, and then, after a considering pause, "But I think he will be all right." They named him Samuel James Boone. Samuel for Maria's father, James for Matthew's, and Boone for all of it, the land and the life and the thing they had built together from a name on a piece of paper, and a debt of gratitude and a courage that had started small and grown into something she could no longer imagine being without. Samuel was, as babies are, fully absorbing. The first months were the world contracted to the small radius of his needs, sleeping, feeding, the specific investigations he conducted with his new hands and eyes, as the world slowly resolved itself into recognizable shapes. Maria had not known how much room a person could take up while being so small. Matthew, who had done this before but not in a long time, moved through the adjustments with steady grace, getting up in the night without being asked, learning this new child's particular language of need. Rose, after an initial period of cautious assessment, became the most devoted presence in Samuel's life. She read him the fable book before he was old enough to understand it, informed him in detail about the workings of the ranch, and by the time he was 3 months old had claimed him with a completeness that neither of his parents could challenge, and neither of them wanted to. Spring came back to the territory in the way it always came, suddenly and specifically, the cold going and the wildflowers appearing in the space of what felt like a single week, the air changing its quality so that you could smell green things in it when you stood outside in the early morning. Maria stood on the east porch one April morning with Samuel against her shoulder, his small warm weight and his sleepy sounds, and looked out at the land she knew now in every season and every light, and felt the kind of fullness that is hard to hold without it spilling. Matthew came out of the barn and saw her standing there and crossed the yard to the porch. He came up the steps and stood beside her and looked out at the same view, the ranch he had built from nothing, the land that had given itself to their work, the distance where the mountains were blue against the sky. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, Samuel between them, and the morning was very quiet except for the windmill turning and the birds and Samuel's small sounds. "Thinking anything in particular?" he said. "Yes," she said. "What?" She looked up at him, at this face that was now as familiar to her as her own, the dark eyes, the gray at his temples, the scar, the quality of steadiness in him that ran all the way down. "That I have the best life," she said. "That I do not know how I got here from where I was, but I am grateful for every mile of it." He looked at her for a long moment with those serious eyes and that warmth underneath that she had learned to read like a language she now spoke fluently. He kissed her temple and then Samuel's head, and then he said very quietly, "Your father knew something." "He did," she said. "He always did." They stood there for a while longer, watching the April morning come fully into itself, and Rose came running out of the house with her braids flying and something important to report about the chickens, and Samuel stirred and made his opinion known, and the day opened up around them in all its ordinary, irreplaceable particulars. In the years that followed, the Boone spread grew. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, in the way things grow when they are tended with care and good sense. Matthew expanded the herd, bought the adjacent parcel when it came available, hired 2 more hands as the operation required it. Maria's kitchen garden became a real garden, and then a real and productive garden that supplied half the household's needs through the summer, and she started trading the surplus in Coulter's crossing, which became a small enterprise of its own. She also, with Matthew's encouragement and Hobbs's assistance, became the person who managed the spread's accounts with the thoroughness her father had taught her, and the books that had been serviceable before were excellent now. Rose grew up with the particular combination of characteristics that comes from being raised by a careful, principled father, and a determined, warm-hearted mother on the open land of the New Mexico Territory. She was self-reliant and direct and fearless on horseback, and deeply attached to her family in the way that does not require constant demonstration, because it is simply the ground of things. By the time she was 12, she could ride the south pasture line by herself and had opinions about cattle that the hands took seriously. She did ask, one evening when she was 10 or so, sitting with Maria in the lamplight while Maria mended and Matthew was at his desk in the office, the question that had been perhaps always there. "Do you remember what it was like?" Rose asked. "Before you came here?" "Yes," Maria said, very clearly. "Were you frightened?" "Yes," Maria said, "quite frightened." But more determined than frightened. Rose considered this. Because of the paper, she knew the story. They had told it to both children in the way families tell their founding stories, honestly and without embellishment, because the honest version was already good enough. "Because of the paper," Maria confirmed. "Your grandfather wrote your papa's name down and told me to find him, and I did." "And Papa was worth it," Rose said, with the particular certainty of a child who has no doubt about something. "He was," Maria said. "He absolutely was." She heard Matthew's chair in the office, the small sounds of a man at the end of his workday, and a moment later he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room in his shirt sleeves with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at the two of them in the lamplight and said, "What are you talking about?" "You," Rose said. "Good things, I hope," he said. "The best things," Maria said. He looked at her across the room, and there it was, still, that particular warmth in his face that was for her, and that she had been receiving for years now, and that still made something in her chest answer to it the way it always had. Samuel grew, as boys do, into the kind of sturdy, cheerful, curious person who is always somewhere they are not supposed to be, and is somehow impossible to be angry at about it. He had Maria's hair and Matthew's eyes and a laugh that was entirely his own, and he worshipped his sister and tormented her with equal energy. And by the time he was 4, he had a complete and proprietary understanding of every animal on the spread. Matthew said he had never seen a child take to horses the way Samuel did, which Maria said she was not surprised by because look at his parents, and Matthew said that was fair. There was a second child. A girl, born when Samuel was 3 and Rose was 11, and they named her Clara, for the woman on the train who had given a frightened young woman half an orange, and the specific grace of being seen without being pitied. Clara Fuentes Boone arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, as though she had taken note of his entrance and decided on a different approach. She was dark-haired and thoughtful, and from her earliest weeks had the quality of a person who observes everything carefully before acting on it, which Matthew said was either very promising or very concerning depending on the day. The family they had become was not the product of a plan. It was the product of a name on a piece of paper, and a dying man's faith, and a young woman's determination, and a widowed rancher's decency, and all the ordinary days that had built up between those things and the life they were living now. It was imperfect in the ways that real things are imperfect, with difficult weeks and exhausted mornings and disagreements that required the work of two people who both care about getting things right. But it was theirs, made by their hands, and it was full to the edges. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, Matthew and Maria sat on the east porch as they had so many evenings before, and looked out at the land going dark under the June sky. The children were in bed, the day's work was done, the night was warm enough that she had left her shawl inside. He reached over and took her hand. 5 years, he said. 5 years, she agreed. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked, which was not a serious question but a ritual one, the kind couples ask each other when they know the answer and want to hear it anyway. "Not 1 minute," she said. "Not 1 mile." He turned her hand over and looked at the turquoise ring in the last of the evening light. It had been her engagement ring for the past 5 years, and before that it had sat in his pocket for 2 months while he waited for May, and she knew both of those things and loved them equally. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life being glad you came," he said. "And I am going to spend the rest of mine being glad my father knew your name," she said. He smiled, a real one, the kind she had been collecting for 5 years, each one as good as the first, and brought her hand to his mouth and held it there. And they sat in the warm June dark and listened to the territory settle into night around them, the windmill and the horses and the distant sound of the land that was theirs. She had left Harlow Creek with $3.40, and a name on a piece of paper, and a stubbornness that her father had always said was her best quality. She had crossed Texas by stage and New Mexico by rail, and the last 15 miles by freight wagon, arriving at the end of the road with 45 cents and a flour sack and more uncertainty than she had been able to let herself fully feel until she had gotten far enough along to feel it safely. The cowboy at the end of that road had given her a room and a cup of coffee and a life she had not known to ask for. He had been worth every mile.